In the final days of World War II, as Nazi Germany collapsed into chaos, strange alliances and desperate last stands unfolded across Europe. But none would be as extraordinary as the battle that took place on May 5, 1945, at an old medieval fortress perched high in the Austrian Alps, Itter Castle. It was here that a tiny American force, joined by German soldiers, would make a stand against a vengeful Waffen-SS unit determined to commit one last atrocity before the war ended. The castle, a stone stronghold overlooking the town of Wörgl, had been converted during the war into a special prison for high-value French political captives. This was no ordinary POW camp. Behind its thick walls were some of the most prominent figures in France: former prime ministers, Daladier, Reynaud; cabinet ministers, leading generals, resistance heroes; even the sister of Charles de Gaulle. The prisoners were treated slightly better than those in concentration camps, but they were still prisoners, isolated, watched, and aware that if Germany lost the war, the SS might kill them to erase evidence and prevent them from testifying in the future. And in late April 1945, as the Allies closed in, the situation inside Itter Castle grew increasingly dangerous. The SS guards began abandoning their posts. Supplies dwindled. Rumours spread that a fanatical SS unit, the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division remnants, was moving through the region, killing collaborators and prisoners to tie up loose ends. On May 3rd, the castle commandant fled, leaving the French prisoners alone behind stone walls with no guards and no protection. Desperate, the prisoners seized weapons left behind and prepared to defend themselves. But they knew they couldn't hold the castle alone. So they did something unthinkable. They sent 2 Austrian resistance fighters to escape the castle and find help from the Americans. The escapees made their way down the mountain under the cover of night, moving carefully through areas where SS units were still active. Their goal? Locate elements of the US 12th Armoured Division, then sweeping into Austria. But what they found was even stranger. Near the town of Wörgl, they encountered Major Josef Gangl, a German Wehrmacht officer. Gangl was no Nazi loyalist. Sickened by the SS atrocities and knowing the war was lost, he had already begun cooperating with the Austrian resistance. He had even surrendered his remaining troops to them rather than let the SS reclaim the town. When the castle escapees begged for help, Gangl made a decision that would make history. He would fight with the Americans to protect the French prisoners from the Waffen-SS. Gangl and the Austrians set off together to find an American unit, and they found one. A small task force led by First Lieutenant John "Jack" Lee Jr. of the 23rd Tank Battalion. Lee was young, bold, and known for taking risks. When told that a group of French VIPs were about to be attacked by SS troops, he didn't hesitate. He ordered his men to mount up, and surprisingly, when Gangl offered to fight alongside him, Lee agreed. It was the only time in the entire war that Americans and German soldiers would fight as allies. Lee's force was tiny: 30 American soldiers, 10 German Wehrmacht volunteers, 1 Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny, a handful of Austrian resistance fighters. Against them, up to 150 to 200 Waffen-SS soldiers, reinforced by stragglers from collapsing SS units, sometimes exaggerated as 600, but still overwhelmingly superior in number. On the evening of May 4th, Lee's Sherman tank rolled up the winding mountain road toward Itter Castle. The French prisoners, who had begun preparing homemade defences, watched in disbelief as the tank's white star appeared through the trees. Help had arrived. But the SS were coming too, and the defenders of Itter Castle had only hours to prepare for one of the most improbable battles in World War II. When the American-German rescue force reached Itter Castle on the evening of May 4, 1945, they knew they were racing against time. The Waffen-SS was already moving through the valleys around Wörgl, still armed, still dangerous, still fanatical. Even with the war all but lost, the SS were determined to spill as much blood as possible before surrendering, and the French prisoners at Itter Castle were at the top of their list. As the Sherman besotten Jenny rumbled across the stone bridge into the courtyard, the French VIPs stared in disbelief. Many had assumed they would be executed within hours. Now, for the first time in years, they saw American uniforms, and even stranger, German Wehrmacht uniforms fighting with them. Lieutenant Jack Lee jumped down from the tank, cigarette in hand, smiling as if he were casually stepping into a bar. Among the prisoners was former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who later recalled that Lee possessed a confidence bordering on madness. Lee immediately gathered everyone in the courtyard. His voice echoed off the stone walls. "Gentlemen, this castle isn't falling today." There were more French dignitaries than defenders. The Americans numbered just 30. Gangel's German volunteers added only 10 more. The Austrians were skilled but lightly armed. Their combined strength was laughably small for defending a medieval fort against a well-armed SS assault. Still, they had a castle, and Lee intended to use every inch of it. He stationed the Sherman tank at the front gate to block the only vehicle approach. He positioned American riflemen in the towers, machine guns at windows, and Austrian fighters along the walls. The French prisoners, generals, politicians, intellectuals, grabbed rifles enthusiastically. Most of them had never fired a gun in their lives. General Maurice Gamelin, a former chief of the French army, insisted on taking a position at the northeast tower. Pierre Laval, a former prime minister, was given a rifle he held awkwardly but determinedly. Even de Gaulle's sister took up a weapon. The castle, normally quiet at night, now buzzed with frantic activity. Ammunition was stacked on stairwells. Sandbags were dragged into firing positions. The defenders smashed window panes so rifles could be pushed through without obstruction. Meanwhile, Major Gangel slipped out of the castle under the cover of dusk, hoping to reach American lines and bring reinforcements. He drove toward Wörgl in a commandeered truck, dodging SS patrols on the roads. Lee knew that if Gangel failed, the castle was on its own. Shortly after midnight, the defenders heard the first distant crack of rifle fire. The Waffen-SS had reached the lower slopes. Their scouts were probing the forest around the castle, looking for weaknesses, studying the walls. By 3 a.m., the moonlit silence of the valley was broken by the muffled clatter of armoured vehicles. German self-propelled guns, half-tracks, and trucks full of infantry moving into attack positions. They had the numbers, the mobility, and the firepower. They fully expected the castle to collapse in minutes. Inside the castle, the French prisoners crowded the walls, gripping rifles and peering into the darkness. Former French commander General de la Laurencie muttered, "Mon Dieu, there are hundreds of them." Lee only grinned and said, "Then we don't have to go looking for a fight." The SS opened fire just before dawn. Machine gun rounds cracked into the stone walls. Mortar shells exploded in the outer courtyard. The Sherman's armour rang like a bell when it was hit by the first anti-tank round, but it held. American gunners returned fire immediately. Flames lit the sky as the Sherman's 50 caliber gun swept the forest edge. Rifle fire echoed from the towers as Americans and French VIPs fought shoulder to shoulder. For hours, the defenders held the walls. At first light, Major Gangel's truck was spotted returning up the mountain road. In the back were a handful of American reinforcements, but not enough to stop the SS. As Gangel leaped from the truck to warn the defenders of an incoming mortar team, a sniper's bullet struck him in the chest. The Wehrmacht major who had turned against the Nazi regime died instantly. He became one of the only German officers ever killed fighting alongside Americans in World War II. The defenders now realized something chilling. They were surrounded. Their tank was taking damage. Reinforcements were not coming soon enough. The SS was preparing a full assault. And the battle for Itter Castle had only just begun. At dawn on May 5, 1945, Itter Castle shook under the first coordinated Waffen-SS assault. For hours, the defenders had held off probing fire, scouts in the trees, snipers testing their aim, machine guns stitching the walls. But now the real attack was coming. The valley below filled with movement. Through gaps in the trees, the defenders saw dark shapes advancing uphill, hundreds of Waffen-SS grenadiers, some in full combat gear, others in mismatched uniforms scavenged from abandoned stores. Many were fanatics from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, determined to kill the high-value French prisoners rather than let them fall into Allied hands. Lieutenant Jack Lee stood atop the gatehouse, binoculars raised. He saw enough to know the truth. They were outnumbered at least 20-1. Inside the courtyard, the French VIPs, statesmen, generals, diplomats, clutched their rifles with white knuckles. Most had no real training. Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had never held a gun before yesterday. General Gamelin's hands trembled from age more than fear. Yet none of them asked to retreat. They had nowhere to go. The assault began with a deafening crack. An SS 20mm cannon opened fire from a concealed position, shredding the stonework around the Sherman tank. The vehicle rocked violently as armor-piercing rounds sparked off the turret. The tank's crew answered with controlled .50 caliber bursts, sweeping the tree line and momentarily forcing the attackers to take cover. Moments later, mortar shells whistled overhead. The first landed in the outer courtyard, blasting apart a wagon and showering the defenders with splinters of wood. Another exploded against the northwest wall, blowing a hole through the parapet where 2 French prisoners had been positioned moments earlier. Lee shouted orders, shifting his men to reinforce weak points. American riflemen fired from arrow slits, picking off SS soldiers attempting to scale the lower slopes. The Austrians moved between positions carrying ammunition. German Wehrmacht volunteers fired down the main road, protecting the vital bridge. It was a bizarre sight, Americans, Germans and French resistance fighters standing shoulder to shoulder against the SS. At around 8 a.m., the SS brought up a recoilless rifle team. Using the forest cover, they crawled into a flank position and fired directly at the Sherman. The shell hit the tank dead on. Metal shrieked, sparks flew, and the engine compartment burst into flames. The crew bailed out instantly, coughing and blinking through smoke as bullets snapped around them. The tank had been their heaviest firepower, their moving bunker, and now it was a burning wreck. The defenders were shaken. The SS cheered and surged forward. But Lee refused to yield. He grabbed 2 ammunition crates, sprinting across the courtyard under fire, shouting for the men on the eastern wall to keep shooting. Even French officials, men who had once commanded entire armies, found themselves taking orders from a 27-year-old American lieutenant. The SS concentrated their fire on the castle's weakest point, the outer gate. Mortar rounds hammered the stone archway. Machine gun teams laid down suppressing fire while grenadiers crawled forward, hugging the terrain, inching toward the entrance. Inside, the defenders prepared for close combat. Austrians stacked sandbags behind the door. Wehrmacht soldiers loaded captured Panzerfausts, aiming them through narrow murder holes. French generals crouched behind overturned tables, rifles shaking in their hands. There was no more separation of rank or class. Everyone was now simply a defender. The SS launched a direct assault. Grenades exploded against the gate. Rifle fire ricocheted through the courtyard. A squad of SS men tried to rush the entrance, but a blast from a captured MG-42, manned by an American private, cut them down. Still, more came. By mid-morning, the defenders were running low on ammunition. The French prisoners had fired so much that many had worn blisters onto their fingers. The castle walls were chipped, cracked, pockmarked with holes. Smoke drifted through the corridors. The SS were gathering for another push, larger, heavier, more coordinated. Lieutenant Lee knew they could not hold much longer. He climbed the tower, looked out over the valley, and whispered, "Where the hell are those reinforcements?" He didn't know it yet, but help was coming, and it was only minutes away. By late morning on May 5, 1945, the courtyard of Itter Castle was filled with smoke, rubble, and exhausted defenders who had no idea how much longer they could hold. Ammunition was nearly gone. The French prisoners were down to their last magazines. The Sherman tank lay burning beside the gatehouse, its smoke mixing with drifting mortar dust. The Waffen-SS, realizing the defenders were weakening, prepared for their final assault. Hundreds of SS troops had moved into new positions around the castle perimeter, bringing up heavier weapons, MG-42s, grenade launchers, even captured anti-tank rifles. From the tower, Lieutenant Jack Lee could see their movement clearly now. The fog had lifted completely, and for the first time the defenders could see just how badly they were outnumbered. Rows of black uniformed troops shifted in the tree line below, stepping over bodies of their fallen comrades. More were filtering up the slopes. A full encirclement was nearly complete. Inside the castle, morale was crumbling. French prisoner Edouard Daladier leaned against a wall, breathing heavily. General Gamelin wiped sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. Austrian fighters checked their last grenades. The German Wehrmacht volunteers, their ammo pouches empty, scavenged rifles from fallen SS men. Everyone knew the truth. If the SS broke through the gate, the battle was over, and every prisoner in the castle would die. The SS opened their final assault with a storm of machine gun fire. Bullets tore into the stone walls, chipping mortar and forcing the defenders to duck low. Mortars landed in the courtyard, blasting holes in staircases and filling corridors with smoke. A group of SS grenadiers rushed the gate again, firing from the hip as they advanced. An Austrian fighter pulled the pin on his last grenade and hurled it toward the attackers. The explosion sent bodies flying backward, but more SS troops surged forward to take their place. A French general shouted desperately, "They're coming! They're breaking through!" Lieutenant Lee sprinted across the courtyard, again dashing through a hail of bullets to direct his men. He grabbed a fallen Panzerfaust, aimed it through a crack in the wall, and fired. The blast tore open a cluster of SS troops gathering behind a stone outcropping. But even Lee knew it wasn't enough. He ducked behind a parapet and yelled to an American sergeant, "We're out of time!" Then, at that moment, when the defenders were seconds from collapse, the sound that every man in the castle had prayed for finally echoed up the valley. American engines. Dozens of them. From the south, a column of vehicles from the 142nd Infantry Regiment, US 36th Division, burst into view. Armoured cars, half-tracks, jeeps and infantry squads thundered up the mountain road toward the castle, guns blazing as they smashed through isolated SS pockets along the way. The defenders heard shouting, English shouting, from the forest. Then came the unmistakable sound of a US 50 caliber machine gun firing from a moving jeep. The SS troops froze. Some tried to continue the attack, firing wildly at the approaching reinforcements. Others began to break and run. Moments later, the entire Waffen-SS assault collapsed as the 142nd Regiment slammed into their flank, cutting down stragglers and scattering the rest into the forest below. American infantry stormed the castle bridge, shooting their way past fleeing SS men who had moments earlier believed victory was assured. Inside the castle, the defenders watched in stunned silence. The relief force charged into the courtyard, weapons raised, scanning for threats. Lieutenant Jack Lee stood up from behind a shattered wall, dust-covered, exhausted, and grinning. He shouted, "About damn time!" The battle was over. The Waffen-SS was wiped out or captured. The French 5 IP prisoners survived. The castle stood, battered but unbroken. Major Joseph Gangle, who had died defending the prisoners earlier that morning, was hailed as a hero by both Austria and the United States. It was the only time a Wehrmacht officer died fighting alongside Americans. Lieutenant Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. The French VIPs later said that the battle had felt like a fever dream, a bizarre alliance, an impossible defence, a final burst of violence in the very last days of the war. But it was real, and it became one of the most remarkable last stands in modern military history. 30 American soldiers, 10 Germans, a handful of Austrians, and a castle full of unarmed French dignitaries held off 600 Waffen-SS troops and won.